Okay, hello everybody and welcome back. We're going to just update the AI guard from one of our previous videos to use the AI perception system. So this is the demo scene that we had before, back at the end of a few of our other tutorials, but it's basically the AI guard that we're going to look at. So if you look at the directory, we've got the guard blackboard and the guard behavior tree as we had before. Guard character, it's the guard controller we're going to change this time around. So if you remember back in the previous tutorials, we basically had the pawn sensing, which I've unhooked here. We had the pawn sensing doing a quick check to see if the thing that it senses got the particular enemy tag, and then if it has, it's adding it to a set of threats and binding it to say if this threat gets deleted, then we know and we collect the garbage for it. So we call this custom event threat destroyed. So what that means is that it calls this collect garbage method, which then removes it from the threats list essentially. So what we want to do is we basically want to do the equivalent of this pawn sensing thing, but we want to do it in the new sort of, well, I'm going to say modern, but not particularly modern way of doing it. So this is inside the event graph of the guard controller. So the first thing we can do is we add the AI perception component to the list of components for the guard controller. Let's just select that. Let's look at the way this kind of pawn sensing thing gets set up first. So there's a whole bunch of values here. Forget about those because those are deprecated. This is senses config thing that we're actually interested in. So we're going to add, initially we're just going to add the sight sense, but you can actually, no, we'll add a second sense as well. And here's where it gets kind of tricky. So senses have an associated, so a sense is something like hearing or sight or perception of a particular event happening in the world. A sense can pretty much be anything that the AI wants to perceive. Now the interesting thing here is that for a sense to work, it's usually associated with a config. So to make matters a bit more complicated, a sense can be reconfigured in different ways based on different configurations. And actually at runtime, if you're doing C++ code, you can actually reconfigure that via sending another config to the sense again. But for now, what we're saying is for each sense, there's a matching configuration that tells the sense what to do. So we'll add a site config here, and for each one, there's a whole bunch of parameters. So you'll see that each time I configure a sense, I'm going to give it a bunch of different types of parameters. So let's have the hearing one here. And you'll see that parameters are different. So let's go quickly through this. The parameters. Sense sight should be filled in automatically. Sight radius is obviously how far they can look. Loose sight radius is how far a thing gets away before this thing can't see it anymore. Peripheral vision is the sort of angle that the vision actually works in, the sort of the view cone essentially, which means it's 45 degrees either side of the front. Now there's an important thing here that's actually changed in 4.9, I believe, and that is that the idea of affiliation is now built into things. Long story short, this didn't used to kind of work, and it's there's a thing called I think it's F generic team identifier or interface that you can add in C++ that allows you to specify whether a thing is friendly towards another thing or not. In this case, we're just going to bypass some of that and say everything's sensed. So we'll switch all of those on, but ideally you should be able to set those kind of things up. I don't think it's actually available in Blueprint yet, but I'm not entirely sure. Certainly I use the F generic team interface on my own code, but I do it on the character rather than the controller. This one expects, I think, it on the controller. Either way, for now, just to make sure we've got this sort of perception component working, switch them all on. Max age is what was the time since the last sense of this thing. So when we've got this perception component, what you'll find is that there's a couple of different events you can bind to. Now, the pawn sensing basically just says I have sensed a thing, a pawn. What we actually want is whether we've perceived something. So let's go for the on perception updated thing, and I'll just drag it up to near where the pawn sensing is, just because it feels naturally I should sort of move them closer together. So what this event's saying is essentially when a thing in the perception system is perceived by this actor, it will give us a list of actors that are being perceived. So basically when there's an update occurs. So what we probably want to do is we want to loop over this. Let's just for each. I should probably turn off caps lock, shouldn't I? So we're going to loop over this set of things, set of actors we've perceived, and for each one of them, so for this one, we probably want to say get actors perception. You'll notice that that's added the AI perception component that we've already got in the character. We do that in the loop body. So basically we loop through each actor that we're perceiving, and we can actually get the kind of thing that we're perceiving from here. So let's just break actors perception info, and that gives us the target that we've perceived and the stimuli. So the stimuli is basically sense, sight, hearing, whatever other events we want to perceive about them. So here's the question. We could break that stimuli down and interrogate if we want, but right now what we want to do is essentially the equivalent of what the pawn sensing thing was. So we just want to check to see if this guy's got the tag. So let's say, okay, we want essentially all of this stuff. We want all of this stuff as well, really. So what we could do is we could just feed the sort of we could feed the target that we've just sensed straight into the pawn input there. But that's not, I don't really like doing that, because obviously I want to leave that intact essentially. But let's just copy all of these nodes. Oops, I've just copied a couple of others, and that one, and we'll paste them somewhere up here. Wow, I think I've grabbed a couple more than I expected there. Don't want to do that. So what we want to do is we basically want to let's just move that around a little bit. We want to say check the target we've sensed. If it's got the tag, then add it to the threats. So you remember the actor threats is a unique property, so if it's already in there it'll just ignore it. So we can add the same guy more than once and it'll just ignore the second time round. And then once it's added, we can bind to the destroyed event just to say we need to garbage collect if the guy gets destroyed. And that's really all that you need for doing a perception is to get this perception updated event and look through the list of actors that we have some perception about. It could be that we've lost perception as well, by the way, in this. And then we can do a get actors perception, so we can ask the perception component to give us the perception of that particular actor and break it apart into the stimuli that we've got from them. So in this sense, we could, do a for each loop on that, and we could, break that one apart. And there's a whole bunch of things that you get for each stimulus. So like, when was it last sensed, where was it from, a name for the stimulus. Oh, that's new in 4.9. That's actually quite useful. So it could say site here or whatever for the actual tag. That's good. It was missing this way of checking what type of sense it was for a long time, so that's kind of useful. But we don't really, if we're just doing it like we did with the sort of spawn sensing thing, all that's literally doing is saying something sensed, shove it in a list. So we're doing essentially that here without all of this for loop to say what type of sense was it. But we could be picky and say, okay, so get all of the senses for that thing. What type of sense is the most important one? Is sight the most important? Is hearing the most important? When was it last sensed? Have we just lost sight of it? Have we just lost hearing? Kind of, has the hearing timed out or something like that? So we could do that in these nodes if we wanted to. I'm just going to delete those for now. So it's important to check that you've got this working. The easiest way to do that is leave all of your old setup in place. Just disconnect this node by right clicking it and breaking it, and then add this one in and just see if you get the same behavior as you did before. So we should have a guy who goes around attacking these guys. And I don't believe I've... Oop. What was that note? Oh, yeah, okay, so I didn't bind the event to that target, which is a bit bad. Let's do that now. Bind event to the target. What else do I need? I need to... Oh, of course, I'm probably not perceiving the guy, am I? Let's just make sure I've got all of my affiliations set correctly. And have I got my... What's the names? Enemy tags, and we should have an enemy. Yeah, okay, so it's tagged as enemy. Are those guys tagged as enemy? We should look at the tags for the characters. There we go, tags, enemy, yep. So the other thing to check here is that you've got your guard character in the scene, say. Make sure that you've got the controller as the correct controller. If you type in hope if I could actually type on my keyboard. Oop, no, it's on there, isn't it? AI controller class, it's not doing anything because for some reason that got set back to nothing. So our controller class should be guard controller, and if we save that and play it again, this guy should, well, it's certainly seeing the actor, so it's probably that it's not adding it to the threats properly. So let's just see. Did it say saw an actor, not an enemy? Let's try that again. Saw an actor, not an enemy. Okay. So it thinks that that thing isn't an enemy, which means it's got a perceived object without the tag. Interesting. Oh, here we go. That's what's wrong. When I cut and paste the inlet nodes there, I forgot to put the impactor, didn't I? So again, when you're cutting and pasting these things, just make sure you've got your connections matched up again. So let's just go back and play it, and this guy now should aggro on these guys. So you can see that it just talked about adding 3 threats to the threat array. Now it's switched on its behavior, and it'll start hitting and attacking these guys. So just to go over that again, essentially what we're doing is, let's make this a tad bigger. We're adding a perception component to the controller of the character. We're making sure that the character is using that controller. We're then doing a loop through any actors with info updated. We're saying get the perception. Now we could actually just pass straight through this value into here, to be honest, because it's just passing the actor back again. But for now, I wanted to give us a choice to break out the sense stimuli so we could do different things with like what we perceive about it. So we could perceive hearing and sight differently, or do different things based on how we perceive it. But for now, we're breaking that apart, but it still passes the actor, so we'll use the actor. We'll say, has it got the tag, which is basically a string saying enemy as a tag? If it does, we print something out to remind us what's happening. We add it to the threats list like we used to do before, and then bind an event to say if this thing gets killed or destroyed for whatever reason, we then call the collect garbage method. So that's it really. That is like pawn sensing. But obviously we can do different things. Let's just expand that a little bit. So the senses themselves can be configured differently, and we can use this actor perception blueprint info to say what type of stimulus this sense was and how old it was, so how long since we've sensed it. So we can do different things if we want to configure different types of senses. Like you might have a sense when a specific event occurs, like, I don't know, a rock fall in a sort of terrain or something, and have that sense kick off a completely different set of behavior, which means that we can actually handle different types of senses in different ways now. So just have a look at this. Basically, we need to get the actor's perception for that actor and then break it apart with this actor perception blueprint info. And there's the same thing in C++, so you can do exactly the same stuff. And that gives us more information about the senses that are actually being applied. And you can create your own senses. So in my tactical AI, I've got different types of senses here. I've got like a tactical sight sense that uses a more physically correct sight model, for instance. It does things like dulls the sense if it's not directly in front of you and that kind of thing. So it's a little bit more physically correct. You might have senses for particular events in your game, or sensing particular objects. It's actually quite a configurable system, but it does tend to be a little bit kind of setup heavy. So you need a sense itself. You need to create a sense. You might need to create a sense config for that sense to configure it, because obviously senses generally aren't useful unless you can configure them specifically for each type of character. The only other part that you might think of is like, what is the dominant sense? So basically, which is the sense that's going to be evaluated most importantly, because there is some throttling in terms of how much time it spends doing the perception system. So there is a fair bit of stuff under the hood going on with this perception system, but if you want to have a go, I suggest you create your own sense and make a sense config associated with it, and then you'll be able to add it to this senses config thing in AI Perception and have it work. It's actually quite an interesting process, but not very well documented yet. So there you go. That's how to update the old perception system to the new one. You can actually delete that pawn sensing component now. Well, the other thing is that the perception system itself, when you add it, so there's the perception component, so that is the sort of receiver of things. You might also need a perception source component, a stimuli source, which is a way of doing, causing a sense to happen. So for instance, if you've got a sound generating object that makes a sound, you might have to add a stimuli source that'll say create the sound sense. So this is a way of saying I'm a provider of that sense. Generally what happens is when you declare the type of sense that you've got set up, it automatically registers. So if you look at the value here, it registers those senses as kind of automatically added onto actors, so you don't need to do this, but just be aware that there is that stimuli source. If you can't get your perception to work, you might want to make sure that you've got one of these in your scene creating the sense in the first place. So that's it really. Hopefully that'll get you up to speed with it. If you've got any questions, obviously leave them in the comments and I'll get them answered as quickly as possible. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.